Thank you all so much. It's really a wonderful honor to be with you all today. And what I'd like to do today is to share with you some of the excitement and findings from the hybrid new field of contemplative neuroscience, which is where I am investing a lot of my personal attention and energy these days. So with that as a little brief introduction, let me tell you what contemplative neuroscience is and give you a sense of the range of how we can approach this from a scientific perspective today. We've been interested in using the best tools of neuroscience and the concepts of neuroscience to understand how the brain can be transformed through the engagement with purely mental practices that have been derived from the world's great contemplative traditions. The framework of this work, as Meng mentioned, is the idea of neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity simply refers to the fact that the brain is the organ which is built to change in response to experience, more than any other organ in our body. There are many different mechanisms of neuroplasticity, and it is clear that the intentional deployment of specific mental training strategies can induce plastic changes in the brain which endure and which can transform our cognitive and emotional styles. And I hope to convince you of that today. I'll talk also a little bit about relations between the brain and experience and how we can actually study that objectively in the laboratory. A little bit about the embodied mind, the idea that our minds and brains are not simply supported by a disembodied architecture, but rather there's bidirectional communication between the brain and the body, which provides a mechanism for our minds to influence our bodies in ways that may be consequential for health. And I will make some references to that also, and I'll end with some comments on the impact of this work on both science and society. So let me say a little bit about this propitious historical moment in which we all find ourselves. And that is a moment where there is an extraordinary possibility of a serious interchange between neuroplasticity and ideas and techniques from neuroscience and contemplative practice. Some of this is driven by developments in science. One of those is epigenetics. Epigenetics refers to the fact that genes are regulated by the environments in which those genes reside. The idea that our genetic structure provides an unalterable blueprint, which then affects our behavior in a deterministic way, is an antiquated, wrong-headed, Newtonian conception of genetics. It's not the way things work. The genes that are expressed in our brains are ones that are tremendously influenced by the environment, including our mental environment. We know that there are certain mental dispositions that can produce an impact on gene expression. Some of those expression changes can persist throughout the entire life of an organism. So there's really an extraordinary window that is provided into the brain through modern research in epigenetics. There are translational research initiatives, some of which I'll talk about today, where we're taking some of these ideas from the laboratory and bringing them into the field. And we can glean from translational studies in the field the impact of certain contemplative practices in real-world settings, and collect data in the process that will both help refine the methods, the contemplative strategies themselves, as well as provide evidence of their impact. One of the things that I've been talking a lot about these days, both within my lab as well as outside, is an idea called neurally inspired behavioral interventions. It turns out that there is no more effective way to produce localized and specific changes in the brain than behavioral or mental interventions. Behavioral or mental interventions can produce more specific biological changes than any currently known biological method. That is, any known medication, for example. Medications affect the brain quite systemically. They often produce effects in systems other than those that were targets of the intervention to begin with. Behavioral strategies are the way to produce more specific effects in the brain than any known intervention today. Another idea that I've been bandying about on the bully pulpits that I've been privileged to stand on is this one of putting the brain back into biomedicine, which is a pathway to putting the mind back into medicine. We know that psychosocial factors, for example, play a very significant role in modulating the course of certain physical illnesses like cardiovascular disease, asthma. These are disorders that are major public health concerns. If the environment, the psychosocial environment, can modulate these disorders, presumably information from the environment is getting in and getting under the skin and changing the brain in ways which have impact on the body. By working out the mechanisms through which the brain communicates with the body, we can begin to put the mind back into medicine in a way which will offer potentially new targets of interventions, which is precisely one of the important strategies that we're pursuing with disorders, for example, like asthma. Okay, so that's just a few teasers. I want to just give you a feel for some of the kinds of work that we've been doing over the last several years, which have brought us to this point. And one of the ones that we've been very interested in particular, is the possibility that we can, through mental exercise, voluntarily enhance compassion. This is an idea which was really first emerged in the context of dialogues that we've held with the Dalai Lama, in the context of meetings that were put on by the Mind and Life Institute. And actually, Adam Engel is in the audience here, who is the director of the Mind and Life Institute, which is an organization that has been at the forefront of promoting a dialogue between the world's great contemplative traditions and modern science. And one of the ideas that emerged in these dialogues many years ago was the prospect of putting compassion on the scientific map. And when I first met the Dalai Lama in 1992, I made a commitment to myself and to the Dalai Lama that I was going to come out of the closet with my interests in meditation, which had been very subterranean up until then. I went on my first meditation retreat in 1974 when I was a second-year graduate student at Harvard, and the faculty there were ready to dismiss me as someone who is totally abandoning ship. But I did have the clear sense that I would come back to science and that I really wasn't leaving science. But in any case, those interests were kept under the rug for quite some time. In 1992, I first met His Holiness, and at that meeting, I had a very profound understanding that now was the right time to come out of the closet and to go public with this interest, and also to have the prospect of bringing the concepts and tools from neuroscience that we had honed so effectively in the study of negative states like anxiety and fear and sadness, and bring those same strategies to study positive mental qualities virtuous mental qualities like compassion. So one of the ways that we thought would be a useful beginning step is, okay, let's take people who are the putative experts in the voluntary cultivation of compassion. Now, it turns out that there are such people who have spent literally thousands of hours, actually tens of thousands of hours, formally practicing particular mental strategies that are designed to cultivate compassion. And we launched a study in the year 2000 with long-term contemplative practitioners. These included Tibetan Buddhist monks, as well as lay people, most of whom resided in Asia, and we flew them over to our lab in Madison, Wisconsin, and had them in residence for a number of days where they were undergoing testing. And a number of people close to His Holiness were instrumental, including His Holiness himself, in helping us to recruit participants for this unusual project. We began in an incredibly simple way. We decided to start in a very basic way, and what we did is illustrated here in a very simple cartoon of the experimental protocol, where we had practitioners alternate periods where they were just in a neutral state and periods during which they are meditating, excuse me, in this case, cultivating compassion, and they were doing this in short periods of time. And during these neutral and meditation periods, we challenged their meditation states, and I won't play these for you, but we presented auditory stimuli that were very, very loud, and in one case, they were strongly negative emotional stimuli that were auditory signs of human suffering. They were cries and screams that were very pronounced. And you can think of this, when you go to a cardiologist, you might sometimes be given a cardiac stress test where you're challenged on a treadmill. Well, this is a brain stress test, if you will, but specifically looking at how practitioners respond to stimuli that depict human suffering when they're either in a neutral state or in the state where they're generating compassion voluntarily. Now, what does it mean to generate compassion voluntarily? One of the practitioners is actually someone quite well known who is on, his picture can be found on Meng's wall, and he is Mathieu Ricard, a well-known monk. He has been a Buddhist monk since 1967. He's French by nationality. The wonderful thing about Mathieu is that he also holds a PhD in molecular biology from the Pasteur Institute, where he worked with François Jacob, the Nobel laureate. In the words of Mathieu, this is what the practitioners were doing during this particular protocol when they were generating voluntarily the state of compassion. And I'll just read part of this to you. He said, "What we have tried to do for the sake of the experiment is to generate a state in which love and compassion permeate the whole mind with no other consideration, reasoning, or discursive thoughts." This is sometimes called pure compassion. Now, there's those commercials on television which tell you don't try this at home. Well, I would encourage all of you to try this at home, but don't be disappointed if you find that your whole mind, with no other consideration, reasoning, or discursive thoughts, is permeated by love and compassion. This is something that takes a lot of practice, and that's precisely the idea of using the long-term practitioners in the first place. So this is a picture of Mathieu, and I love to show this picture because he had been in the MRI scanner for more than 3 hours just when this picture was taken, just prior to when this picture was taken. Most people don't look like this when they come out of the scanner after being in there for 3 hours. So he is someone who is wonderful to have in the laboratory because he does this so joyously. And one of the really virtues of working with these long-term practitioners is they can have these short periods of meditation where they're generating compassion, and at least by their own report, they're able to do this very easily in the crazy environment of the laboratory while they're lying in an MRI scanner that feels like a jackhammer and is producing very loud sounds from the scanner itself. So we've been interested in what brain circuits are recruited when these long-term practitioners voluntarily generate compassion. And I should mention that we compare these to age-matched controls where we've taught them the same practice. And actually, Mathieu Ricard developed a training regime that we can offer to novice practitioners who wish to learn the practice. And these are individuals who are interested in meditating, have never done it before, and they practiced for 1 week prior to coming into the laboratory. This is a busy slide, and I'll only walk you through part of it, but one of the brain regions which is strongly modulated by this meditation practice is a very interesting part of the brain, and it's called the insula, and specifically the anterior insula, which is shown in this axial image here. The insula is a region of cortex that is a part of the brain that is the only part of the brain to contain a viscerotopic map of the body. And what that means is that the visceral organs are actually mapped like retinotopy, like the eye is mapped in the visual cortex. The visceral organs are mapped in the insula. So this is a region of the brain through which information from the body is conveyed to other circuits in the brain, and it's also a part of the brain that has descending pathways to these different visceral organs and can modulate activity in those organs. And what we find is that in the long-term practitioners, they're the ones in red down here. The solid lines are during meditation. The dotted lines are during neutral. The blue lines are the novice practitioners. And what you can see is these are the responses using functional MRI that we detect in the insula when the long-term practitioners are exposed to these negative emotional sounds. And what you can see is a big difference between the dotted line and the solid line in red for the long-term practitioners. It indicates that activity in their insula is being strongly modulated by their meditation practice, whereas in the novices, there's really no difference between the neutral and the meditation periods. And it suggests that the insula is an important piece of the story in terms of how the brain is changed in response to compassion training. It's not just the insula, however. There are a number of other parts of the brain that are dramatically altered in function by compassion meditation, and two additional regions are the amygdala, which plays a very critical role in emotion, and this area called the TPJ on the in the right hemisphere. It stands for the temporoparietal junction, and the TPJ has been strongly implicated in perspective taking, and particularly the adoption of another person's perspective, and it's been strongly implicated in empathy. And what we see in all of these cases is that activity in these regions during the generation of compassion is strongly elevated in the long-term practitioners, but not in these novice controls. Now, one of the things we've been doing very recently is this, and I have to tell you a little anecdote before I show you this next set of findings. One of the early visits that we made to Dharamsala, India, to be with His Holiness, was a visit where he asked us if we would give a talk to young monks in the Namgyal Monastery, the monastery connected to his residence. And this was a time when Francisco Varela was alive. Francisco was a very eminent neurobiologist who is one of the co-founders of the Mind and Life Institute, and who developed the idea and hybrid discipline that he called neurophenomenology, which I'll talk about in a little while. But Francisco was on this visit, and we gave this talk to these young monks in the Namgyal Monastery. There were about 200 monks in the audience, all sitting dutifully on cushions on the floor. And we had instrumentation with us on that visit, and we thought that instead of just giving a dry academic lecture, we'd actually show them how this stuff is done. And so we put electrodes on Francisco, and we had a laptop, and we were showing the monks the display of brain oscillations, brain electrical activity on the laptop that we can record from a person's head. And when we explain, when we put the cap on to measure the brain activity and showed them on the laptop, as soon as we did this, all 200 monks just burst out laughing, just cracking up hysterically. And we thought that they were laughing because the Francisco looked kind of funny with the electrode cap on. It turns out that they were laughing at where we were placing our electrodes. They thought it was hysterical that we thought that the key to compassion was the head as opposed to the heart. Now, it took us many decades to get back to their editorial comment about our lack of insight. And very recently, we have been interested in how the heart and the brain are actually interconnected during the generation of compassion. And I won't go into this in a lot of detail. There are a lot of details to unpack here. And this is some very new work that has just been published in 2009. But one of the what you're seeing here, one of the really cool things that we can do is actually take MRI scans of the heart itself. It turns out that you can do functional MRI of the heart. There are a group of radiologists who are now interested in the development of non-invasive methods for probing cardiac function that will eventually eliminate cardiac angiography. And it's done through the use of real-time MRI. And so what you're seeing here is an image of cardiac-gated MRI, where we gate the MRI scanner, we record the electrocardiogram in the scanner, and we gate the acquisitions to the onset of the main ventricular contraction that we can detect with the EKG recording. And this is a slice through the left ventricle. And you can compute various parameters of cardiac function in this way. And it provides some really cool information. And I'll just show you a little bit of this. This is from a new paper. Antoine Lutz is a scientist in our center. And if you just look at heart rate, there are a lot of other measures that we can derive, but if you just look at heart rate, it turns out that during the generation of compassion among the long-term practitioners, you actually see an elevation of heart rate during the practice itself compared to the novice practitioners. And what's really interesting is this part of the brain called the insula that I mentioned earlier is strongly coupled to the cardiac change in the long-term practitioners and not in the novices. It appears that this region of the brain is sensitive to and driving, we think, the cardiac change. And so this is a parameter of coupling that is on the ordinate here, and it just shows you that during compassion, but not during the neutral period, there's much stronger coupling in the expert practitioners in red compared to the novices in blue. It suggests indeed that there's something about neurocardiac coupling during compassion which we think is very important. And this just shows another area of the brain which is an area of the mid-cingulate region which also has been implicated in various kinds of emotional processing, which shows some of the same kinds of differences as well. Now, one of the things I'm always asked when I talk about this work in long-term practitioners, and I should mention these long-term practitioners are really long-term practitioners. They have to have done a minimum of 10,000 hours of formal practice. Now, 10,000 hours was not just a number we pulled out of the hat. it turns out that for multiple kinds of expertise, sort of entry-level expertise in virtually any complex domain starts at about 10,000 hours. So that's how many hours you got to put in to get to sort of the entry level of expertise. And in our study, the average number of lifetime hours of practice among the long-term practitioners was approximately 34,000 hours of practice. Every one of our practitioners has completed at least one 3-year retreat where they're practicing a minimum of 8 hours a day for 3 continuous years. Many of them have done multiple 3-year retreats. So these are individuals who've really spent a very significant part of their adult life cultivating these qualities. Now, I'm always asked, well, that's really interesting and fine, but there's no way in the world I'm going to put in anywhere near that amount of time. So can short-term training be beneficial? And so the study that I'm about to describe to you is a study that we undertook to examine just that question. And this is a study that is still in the process of being completed. We're still analyzing the data. It's being driven by a wonderfully talented graduate student in my lab by the name of Helen Wang. And one of the cool things that we did in this study is to take meditation-naive individuals and offer them 2 weeks of training, just 2 weeks. And we did MRI scans before and after this 2 weeks of training to determine whether just 2 weeks of training 30 minutes a day actually can produce demonstrable changes in brain function. Moreover, this was a study where when participants signed up, they were told that this was a research project in which they were going to be offered an intervention that's designed to cultivate well-being. We randomly assign people to either a group where they receive compassion training or a group where they receive training derived from cognitive therapy that trains people to cognitively reappraise situations, to appraise them in ways that are more positive. And so this was a true randomized controlled trial. And the other really cool thing about this study is, in addition to the participants getting comparable amounts of training, in each case 30 minutes a day for 2 weeks, the training was delivered over the internet. And so we developed a way to do this over the internet. Participants logged on to a protected website and they received 30 minutes a day of training. The other virtue of having them do this online is that we were able to monitor that they were actually doing it, because they had to make some responses as they were going along, and in order to advance from one step of the training to the next, they had to make certain keystrokes. So it enabled us to have some controls over what they were actually doing. So this just summarizes some of these key components of the methods. It was 2 weeks of compassion, daily practice over the internet for 30 minutes a day. The comparison group was taught cognitive reappraisal. The cognitive reappraisal was delivered in the same way, 30 minutes a day over the internet. We had experts design each of these 2 trainings, and the experts each believed and each had comparable levels of confidence that the training that they were designing would produce beneficial effects in the individuals to whom it was offered. Now, let me say a little bit about what the elements of the compassion training were. Participants were asked to contemplate and to visualize the suffering and then wishing the freedom from suffering for a number of different classes of people. First, a loved one. Now, it's not very difficult for most people to conjure up, visualize someone that you love. It could be a family member, a spouse, a child. To visualize this and visualize suffering that they may have encountered, and then wish that they be free from that suffering. In addition to a loved one, they also direct this meditation to themselves, In addition, we have them directed to a stranger. This is someone that they actually see on a regular basis. It might be a bus driver. It might be a cashier. It might be a janitor. Someone they see on a regular basis, but whose life they really don't know much about. And they're asked to do the same thing for them, to visualize whatever suffering they think they may be having, and then the freedom from that suffering. Then a person is asked to visualize and contemplate a difficult person, someone who pushes your buttons, and then engage in that same process for that person. And finally, directing this to all beings. Participants use mental phrases that are silently repeated. The phrase most often used was, "May you be free from suffering. May you experience joy and ease." They're instructed to notice visceral sensations, especially around the area of the heart, as they engage in this practice. And finally, they are instructed to feel the compassion emotionally and not simply to repeat the phrases cognitively. Now, this was a fairly elaborate experiment. I'm only going to be telling you about very selected pieces of it. We have people go through a simulator, which is a mock MRI scanner before this all happens. At time 1 is a period prior to their random assignment to either the compassion group or the reappraisal group. They come into the laboratory and they get an MRI scan and some questionnaires. They then go through 2 weeks of training for 30 minutes a day on the internet. And then at the end, they get another MRI scan. And we also give them some economic game tasks and a donation task, both of which I'll tell you about. But these are ways of assessing altruistic behavior to see if we can get an actual behavioral measure of the impact of compassion training. So I'll say a little bit about economic games now. About 10 or 15 years ago, one of my good friends, Danny Kahneman, who is a psychologist at Princeton, who also won the Nobel Prize in economics maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and does work in behavioral economics. Danny once said to me, he said, "Richie, if you really want to change the world, you better start hanging out more with economists." And so I've been taking that to heart, and certainly have spent much more time in the last 5 years with economists. And one of the things they do is they have very clever ways of using behavioral tasks in the laboratory to make inferences about cooperative and altruistic behavior. And so we designed a game based upon some things in the literature, but this is a unique game, and I'll walk you through the essential elements of this game. The game involves 3 players, a dictator, a recipient, and a third party. We're interested in the behavior of the third party. At the beginning of the game, the dictator is endowed with a certain amount of money, as is the third party. The dictator makes the first move and can transfer some amount of money to the recipient. The third party can act to redistribute money from the dictator to the recipient so that the transaction is rendered more fair. So let's say the dictator only gives the recipient a really small amount of the money that he was endowed with to begin with. The third party can use some of the money that he was endowed with to take money from the dictator, transfer it to the recipient, and the money is doubled in the process. The participants are informed that they will actually be given all of the money that they play with. So this is for real, there's no deception, and they actually walk away with the money that is transacted. And it turns out that the cooperative solution is a solution that maximizes the gain among all the participants. Yes?
Why is that still under the dictator?
Sorry, no, this is, you mean it should be subtracted? Is that, well, I'm not sure what you're... Well, let me actually show you a subsequent slide. It may help to clarify this. So I want to just show you in an independent sample, not from the intervention study itself, but a study where we had a group of non-meditators come into the laboratory and play this game. What we found is that when the dictator makes an unfair offer, that's these bars here, if a person reports themselves to have very high levels of empathy on a standardized measure of empathy, if they're the third party, they redistribute significantly more money compared with individuals who report themselves to have low empathy. And in response to fair or generous offers by the dictator, there are no differences in the amount of redistribution as a function of empathy. So what these data simply indicate is that those individuals who are behaving in the third party, who redistribute more wealth, they are the ones who also report high levels of empathy. And this is just another way of showing it. So higher levels of empathic concern are associated with more funds that are redistributed by that third party. Now, if you look at the effects of compassion training, it turns out after just 2 weeks of compassion training, there is a significant difference in the performance on this game, with the participants after 2 weeks of compassion training redistributing more wealth compared to the group that was assigned to the reappraisal condition. Remember, these participants were randomly assigned at the outset, so these are not pre-existing differences. Now, in terms of the brain imaging findings, I'll just show you a snippet here. One of the things that we did, in addition to the economic games, is we gave people a simple donation task. This was a study done in college students, and we paid them $165 to participate in this study. And we told them at the end of the study that, I'll just move to that. We told them at the end of the study that we were going to offer them the opportunity to donate some amount of money that they were receiving to any charitable cause of their choosing. The only constraint was that the charitable organization had to have an online mechanism for contributing. So this is, you can think of it as a real-world index of helping behavior. And they were offered the opportunity to donate any amount of money from the funds that they were being given to any charitable cause. And this was, again, for real. There was no deception. They actually executed the transaction online and did it in private, so there was no one looking over their shoulder. Okay. Now, there was no difference between the compassion group and the comparison group, excuse me, in how much money was redistributed. So 2 weeks of compassion training is insufficient to produce any change in this donation task. It was probably naive for us to think that we could produce a change after 2 weeks. However, we did find something interesting, and that is when we looked at the brain data, it turns out that among people in the compassion group, those who showed more activation in an area of the brain that's been implicated in positive emotion were the ones who donated more money. So the greater the activation change, that is, the more increase there was in activation in this region as a consequence of the 2 weeks of compassion training, the more money was donated by the participants in the compassion group. The participants in the reappraisal group showed no significant relation between activation in this region and donations. So what these data suggest is that people respond to this compassion training in a very variable way, which is not surprising to us. And those who respond the most, who are showing the biggest boost in activation in this brain region, are the ones who show the largest increase, the largest amount of donation on this donation task. We also looked at changes in this region on certain questionnaire measures that we gave, and there's this measure of self-reported love. I must confess that I'm not a big fan of these kind of self-report measures, but nevertheless, we give them to see if we can learn anything. These are 2 example items from this questionnaire. I develop strong feelings of closeness to people easily. I find it easy to trust others. Those are 2 items. And it turns out that people in the compassion group, again, who show greater activation in the nucleus accumbens, report a greater increase in love from time 1 to time 2. That is over the course of 2 weeks. So the bigger the boost in signal in this region that has been associated previously with positive emotion, the greater the increases in love they report. And you can see that the purple dots are the participants in the compassion group, the blue are the ones in the reappraisal group, and the participants in the compassion group are showing the biggest boost in both the measure, the self-report measure of love, as well as in this brain signal. So one of the things that we were talking about at lunch was pushing the envelope on methods to interrogate brain function and structure, which is an important piece of what we do in our center. So there's a strong methodological component. About a third of the scientists in my group are physicists these days who are developing new methods. And one of the methods that we use is diffusion tensor imaging. And the uncinate fasciculus is a pathway that connects limbic regions to the prefrontal cortex. And in order to regulate our emotions, to change our relationship to our emotions, which is something that we hypothesize occurs through certain kinds of contemplative training, we think that this pathway is going to be a target of those contemplative interventions. And so this is just the kind of image that you can get with diffusion tensor imaging, and this is the uncinate fasciculus, and we can quantitate parameters of the fiber tract that goes between these regions. And this is something that we're interested in examining as a potential structural target of training and is part of our ongoing research today. I want to just briefly talk about neurophenomenology because the relationship between the brain and experience is really a central piece of what we do. And one of the wonderful opportunities in working with long-term meditation practitioners is these are people who have spent years familiarizing themselves with the mechanisms of their own mind. And when we went into this, we had the conjecture that we would find closer connections, closer correlations, more robust correlations between people's reports of their experience and neural correlates of the experience among long-term practitioners. Because these long-term practitioners spent years training their mind to become familiar with its processes and content. And so if we were examining correlations between the brain and experience, we would observe those correlations more robustly in these long-term practitioners. And so this is an enterprise, as I mentioned earlier, which was pioneered by Francisco Varela. And so we've been looking at this recently, and this is just an example of how we do it. This is a monk in our lab where we're monitoring brain electrical signals with a 256 channel net that's on the head, and the practitioner is rating the clarity of his experience. Clarity is a specific technical term in the contemplative lexicon of practice, and there's quite a lot of variation in the clarity of experience that these practitioners report when they're engaged in meditation. So we have a practitioner meditating and they're reporting on the clarity of their experience. This is actually a picture from some early work In recent work, they are using a joystick to rate this continuously. And this is the kind of data that we can get, where what you see in red is a metric that is related to their reports of clarity on a moment-to-moment basis. This is time moving along the abscissa. And on the ordinate here, for the red line is the clarity of experience, and the blue is a particular parameter of brain activity, of neural oscillation, that we've previously found to be robustly increased during meditation practice. It's oscillations in the gamma frequency range. These are about 40 cycles per second, and they're thought to play a very important role in certain kinds of learning. And we see them very robustly in these long-term practitioners. And so this just shows the correlation across time within a practitioner between his reports of the clarity of experience and the magnitude of signal in the gamma frequency range that's recorded with this measure of brain electrical activity. So this is from one practitioner. This is another example where there are different blocks throughout several days of practice, and this is the quantitative correlation. These are, again, the correlations between their verbal reports and the gamma signal. And it turns out that these correlations are highly reproducible. The blue lines are the correlations in the gamma range, in the gamma frequency. The maroon is correlations in another frequency band that's not nearly as robust. And each unit here, A1, A2, etc., through A9, is a different practitioner. So this is for 9 different practitioners, some of whom we tested on repeated days. And what you can see is that most of the correlations exceed 0.6. And all of the correlations are positive. And a way to summarize it is here. This just shows a depiction of the spatial distribution of these correlations across the head, and you can see that these correlations are quite restricted to the frontal region. This is an aerial view of the head. This is the nose here, and the red depicts highly significant correlations, and you can see that that is found in these long-term practitioners in the frontal scalp region, and we do not find correlations that are significant at all in novice practitioners. Now, in the next remaining minutes, I want to give you 2 other examples. One is the effects of these kinds of practices on attention, and the other is the effects on peripheral biology. And in the interest of time, I'm going to skip a lot of the details, but I want to read you this one quote. This is really a favorite quote of mine. This was written in 1890 in the chapter on attention in William James's 2-volume tome, The Principles of Psychology. It's really an amazing statement. He said, "And the faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character, and will. No one is compos sui if he have it not. An education which should improve this faculty would be the education par excellence." And by the way, the italics are in the original. But it is easier to define this ideal than to give practical directions for bringing it about. I think if James had more contact with the contemplative traditions, he would clearly see the utility of this kind of training for attention. And this is a process that we know a lot about in terms of its underlying neural basis, and we know how to measure it very sensitively behaviorally in the laboratory. And I won't go through a lot of details, but one of the ways we look at it is with the attentional blink task. And just let me tell you what this task is. If you are presented with a rapid stream of stimuli, one every 1/10 of a second, so you get 10 stimuli a second, and say you get a stream of letters, and every now and then there are numbers. And I simply ask you to report every number that you see in a stream of mostly letters. It turns out that you will most likely miss a second number if it follows an initial number within a window of around 300 or 400 milliseconds. This is known as the attentional blink. It's as if your attention is blinking. It's as if you are going momentarily unconscious. So the stimulus is presented, but you are totally unaware of it. And many psychologists have referred to this as a kind of neural refractory period, where the brain is just in a off period, and you simply are inaccessible to incoming information. We were skeptical of that conjecture, and we had the intuition that training in certain kinds of meditation practices, which specifically strengthen attention, should transform this process and decrease the propensity to show this attentional blink. Or another way to say it in a more positive way is it simply increases awareness, moment-to-moment awareness. And that's exactly what happens. I won't go through all the details, but we were able to show that over the course of 3 months of training longitudinally, and it changes brain function in predictable ways as well. These are data which were published a couple of years ago. One of the characteristics of kids with ADHD is that they have very variable response time distributions. The distributions in the middle here are skewed distributions that come from kids with ADHD, where you find a right-sided skew, which means that they're showing abnormally long response times, whereas these are normal subjects up here that show a much tighter distribution. And it turns out that meditation tightens your distribution of response times to make it much less variable. And it changes certain brain patterns which promote this kind of stability. And again, this is very new work that's just in press now, and I won't go through the details because we don't have time. Let me just give you a teaser about peripheral biology. We did a study several years ago where we had people go through an 8-week meditation training procedure. The training was done in the beginning of September. It ended around Thanksgiving time, and we gave people flu shots at the end of their training. We had a control group, and we simply looked at antibody titers mounted in response to the influenza vaccine. And this is what you find. After 8 weeks of training, there's a significantly more robust response to influenza vaccine, suggesting that if these people are exposed to comparable amounts of virus, the people who went through 8 weeks of meditation would have a more robust immune response from the vaccine. So this is just 8 weeks of training in otherwise naive subjects. More recently, we have decided we need to do this a little bit more rigorously and experimentally, and this is a bit of a gruesome picture, but this is blown up, magnified. We use a vacuum procedure. I was telling some people over lunch about this, where we raise the first layer of skin over a course of about 45 minutes to create blisters. There are 12 blisters in a ring. It's a painless procedure. I've had this done to myself too many times. We smear capsaicin cream around the blister, which produces a local flare or an inflammation. We can then extract the fluid from the blisters and look at molecular markers that are associated with healing and inflammation to look at local changes in healing. And we can compute measures of flare size, and I won't go through all the details, but again, 8 weeks of training in mindfulness-based stress reduction compared to a comparison condition produces significantly decreased flare size, and practice matters. Those people who practice more over the course of this 8 weeks turn out to show a larger change in pro-inflammatory cytokines, which play an important role in modulating inflammation and healing, which is what these figures show here. People who went through meditation and who practiced more showed a bigger reduction in pro-inflammatory cytokines. The comparison group showed non-significant changes in the opposite direction. So let me just end with a few challenges, conundrums, and opportunities, and sort of summarize where I think we're going to be in the future. I've talked, well, I'm going to skip that, really about practice and experience in the interests of time. One of the challenges in research of this kind is active comparison groups. I didn't have time to go into details, but we spent a lot of time thinking about appropriate comparison groups like the cognitive reappraisal group for the compassion training, and we've developed another control group that we've used to compare mindfulness-based stress reduction that matches these methods on all kinds of characteristics that are very important. We are particularly interested in applying some of these methods to atypical populations, for example, children with autism, also educational settings, to prisons, where we may help to cultivate skills of emotion regulation which would benefit prisoners, particularly after they're released. We're interested in further exploring internet-based interventions for obvious reasons. We've been very interested in how we can better measure practice. We've developed a wired zafu, which we give to people, which is a meditation cushion that actually has a pressure-sensitive device in it and can record the number of minutes you're actually sitting on it. Even dedicated meditators will sort of slightly inflate so we give these to people, and we don't tell them until after the fact that they've had a wired zafu. Their reports of their time meditating don't always conform to how much time they actually are sitting. But there are other ways of getting at this through experience sampling, where people are beeped during the day and so forth. These are all things that we're working on. We've also been interested in more novel outcome measures such as healthcare utilization. The conjecture here is that these kinds of practices may encourage people to take more responsibility for their health and actually show decreased healthcare utilization, which may make a big difference in terms of the bottom line. And also this idea of sustainable well-being. One of the things that we think happens with this kind of practice is that individuals become directly experience their interdependence with the environment. And sustainable well-being can be defined as psychological well-being in the numerator and a person's ecological or carbon footprint in the denominator. And we've been very interested in both the numerator and the denominator and how they may be affected by this kind of training. And we're doing studies now where we're getting indirect measures of people's ecological footprint to see if that might be something that is altered through long-term practice. So just a few slides about envisioning the future. In 2050, I believe that mental exercise will be accepted and practiced in the same way that physical exercise is today. Also, in 2050, we will have a science of virtuous qualities. In 2050, we'll incorporate the mind back into medicine and better understand how the brain can modulate peripheral biology in ways that affect our health. And I think this will lead us to collectively take more responsibility for our own health. We'll also develop a secular approach to provide methods and practices from the contemplative traditions to teach teachers and children ways to better regulate their emotions and attention and cultivate qualities like kindness and compassion, and regard these qualities as the product of skills that can be trained. We'll transform corrections so that forgiveness can be cultivated in victims and emotion regulation and stress reduction in offenders, and increase awareness of our interdependence upon others and upon the planet, and be more responsible caretakers of our precious environment. And finally, I think that in 2050, we'll see the more active promotion and more widespread adoption of these practices into major institutions of our culture. And I think this will help restore some basic virtuous qualities like civility, humility, gratitude, and other similar qualities in our culture. So to help catalyze and focus our efforts, we're launching at the University of Wisconsin the Center for Investigating Healthy Minds, and this is our mission. And you can check us out. We're now online at investigatinghealthyminds.org. I also want to call your attention to an upcoming opportunity. I think that you got a flyer about it. This is a meeting that's happening in a few weeks in Washington, D.C. With the Dalai Lama, and it is a Mind and Life sponsored meeting. It's also co-sponsored by a number of major schools of education, including Stanford and Harvard and Wisconsin. And we've recently got word that the U.S. Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, is participating in this meeting. It's going to be held October 8th and 9th in Washington, D.C. And finally, I want to just extend my deep bow of gratitude to the people who really do the work. I, these days, feel like I'm mostly an orchestra conductor and do what I can to stay out of the way of an incredibly talented group of people, some of whom are listed here, and also to His Holiness, who has inspired this work tremendously. And I want to end with two quotes, and then I'll really be finished. These are, again, among my favorite corpus. One is from Henry David Thoreau. He said, "As a single footstep will not make a path on the earth, so a single thought will not make a pathway in the mind. To make a deep physical path, we walk again and again. To make a deep mental path, we must think over and over the kinds of thoughts we wish to dominate our lives." And I want to end now with one of my all-time favorite quotes from Albert Einstein. This is something that he wrote in a letter to a friend of his, giving advice about a daughter who was in need of some help. And Einstein said in 1921, "A human being is part of a whole, called by us the universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings, as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circles of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty." Thank you.